Good afternoon, colleagues, and greetings to all of you. I deliberately avoid the word good morning, good afternoon, good day, because I understand all of us are operating in different time zones. As Helen indicated earlier on, this is the last session of the day, decolonization as a verb, getting practical. Before we kick off this session, we'd like to encourage all of us, the participants, to mute off their microphones and also to mute their videos. In this session, we will be looking at decolonization as a verb. The act of doing will be our focus. In the past century or so, scholars, museum practitioners, heritage activists have been focusing on how to interpret and deal with coloniality and colonialism in different forms and different ways. And for us today to engage with the act and the notion of doing, it is an attempt to take the discussion forward. We do know that we have engaged with the question of coloniality and decolonization through subaltern studies. We've tried Afrocentric approaches to ways of doing museums and museology. We've also engaged in a number of ways and various ways with the concept of decolonization through deconstructing. And today our panelists will also enable us to explore this further. My name is Bongani Ndhlovu. I will be the moderator for this session. In order for us to be able to productively and gainfully engage with this in this session, I would like to introduce all our panelists right at the beginning, and thereafter we will be able to engage with them throughout. I would encourage all of you to use the chat room to write for comments, for questions, and we'll be keeping track on that. And as a way of introduction, I will start off with Brandie. Brandie Macdonald describes herself as an indigenous citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. Brandie works as the director of Decolonizing initiatives at the San Diego Museum of Man. Her work focuses on the application of anti-colonial and decolonial methodology in museums. She has managed the First Peoples Fund's Indigenous Youth Leadership Initiatives and the Arts and Economic Capacity Building Initiatives. She is a PhD student in Education Studies at the University of California. That's briefly about Brandie. And our next panelist will be Laura from Broekhoven. Laura is the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum and holds a professoral fellowship at Linaka College. She led a curatorial department of the National Museum of World Cultures, that is Amsterdam, and was a lecturer at the Faculty of Archaeology at Leiden. She is a member of the Women's Leaders in Museums Network and European Ethnographic Museums Directors Group. In this panel, we'll also be joined by Flora Manase, who is a curator of history at the National Museum of Tanzania. Manase has worked in several projects that relate to the German colonialism in East Africa. She was a co-curator of the Tanzanian chapter of the project Remix, Africa in Translation. She has been part of the Tanzanian team working on the Maji Maji War Booty collection. And she continues to curate a number of projects at the National Museum of Tanzania. Jérémie will also actively engage in this discussion. Jérémie McGowan is a designer, a change maker, a punk rock bass player based in Romsa. He directed North Kunsta Museum, he will correct me, from 2016 to 2019. His experimental approach merges speculative design practice with critical challenges. He has an international background in making, teaching, research, and curating. And wait for this, he sometimes remembers that he has a PhD in art history and theory. With those few words, colleagues, I hand over to our panelists who will engage with us further on the concept of decolonizing as a verb. I will kick off with Brandie. Please, Brandie, the platform is yours.
Thank you. Halito chokma. So Nofa Brandie Macdonald, Kachakasha Saya Chapasaya. Hi, my name is Brandie Macdonald. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation. My pronouns are she, her. I'm going to share my screen because we don't have a lot of time. So bear with me, please. So I work at the San Diego, it's located in San Diego at the Museum of Us. It was formerly the San Diego Museum of Man, and this summer we changed our name over to the Museum of Us. This is the building. Our building is an anthropology museum. It was built in 1915. It was founded through the colonial endeavor. Its inside is colonization and was stemmed from colonization. And then if you look at the exoskeleton of our building, it's etched with 9 colonizers. So the facade in our building is also a monument to the colonizers. So when we talk about what does that look like for decolonization, we really thought critically about what it means for us as an institution to do decolonizing work, because we see that this work is not necessarily we write a grant and then we wipe our hands with it as soon as the deliverables are done and we move on to equity or move on to the next thing for our grant. That this is a part of the institutional fabric that we need to, it's a process that has no ending, that we're consistently committed. It's a part of the ethos and it needs to be a part of the ethos of the organization. So instead of saying that it's my department is the Decolonizing Initiatives Department versus the Decolonization Department. Just to give you a footprint of the museum, here we go. Also, excuse me, our museum sits on the ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation within San Diego. The Kumeyaay peoples have been here since time immemorial, and they're the stewards of this land. They continue to work with us, even though we've had a long history of erasing their histories and also limiting access and perpetrating colonial harm to them. And their generosity to continue to work with us to this day, I think, is extremely notable. So this is a footprint of the museum. We have 75,000 ethnographic items, and they range from indigenous communities across the world. And we hold around 7,500 ancestral human remains within our cultural resources that we're actively repatriating back. Decolonizing for us, we recognize that decolonization and decolonizing needs to be extremely fluid because we hold so many cultural resources and belongings and ancestors from communities across the world. And so we look at decolonizing through these guiding principles. We really pulled from the scholarship of Amy Lonetree and then applied them so that it's fluid enough to be applicable for the changing wants and needs of the indigenous communities, the Black indigenous communities of color that have been impacted by our colonial legacy and colonialism as a whole. So this is a meaty slide. I'm not going to go into it, but I wanted to show kind of what our work looks like. My department covers the entire organization. It's not just one thing that cultural resources do or does. We look at decolonizing initiatives as it's a structural and also a practice. And so it's a cultural and a structural shift. And these two items need to be working symbiotically in order for us to have impact and sustainable impact, because I can write policy all day and they could be words that live on my shared drive, or I could write and change the cultural practices within the organization. But as soon as I leave or my cultural resources department leaves, the people direct back to the policy. And so we want to make sure that this lasts long after I'm here or anybody here. So one of the things that we think about is what does it look like for the practical, the tangible experience? And so we think about cultural resource stewardship is really where we dove in first of all, because it was where our colonial rot is. And so we want to make sure that within our cultural resources that we are prioritizing the wants and needs of indigenous communities. And we're also actively looking and changing our language. And so they're not labs, they're storage rooms, they're not specimens, they're ancestors. There's people belongings, and the work that we're doing is stewardship. We are actively working to shift our practices to, if a indigenous population says that we need to clean a cultural resource with animal fat, then that's what we do. And working to figure out what that looks like within a building that's over 100 years old and has critters and different types of animals that enter into this space. And so finding that negotiation space to honor and recognize that indigenous people are the experts on their cultural resources and take that step back for our ego. We also look about consultations and being fully transparent with our consultations around the colonial legacy of how these items came to be. And we do an apology in all of our consultations as well, as we recognize that we have benefited off of the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples globally. And so we recognize that within our consultations as we issue an apology to the communities that have engaged in conversation with us and share space with us. We also look at policy. This is my favorite policy. It was just passed in 2017. And essentially what this colonial pathways policy says is that everything within our cultural resource holding, all 75,000 ethnographic items, and also all of the 7,500 ancestors that we hold and steward, that if they came to us within a colonial pathway, they need to be repatriated back if the community wants them. This is huge. We recognize that this is not going to happen within the next 10 years, but we are committed, and now it is a policy, and we have the procedures, and we've actively started repatriating. So one of the things that people ask is, well, what is a colonial pathway? This is how we define a colonial pathway. We also recognize that colonial and that pathways move both ways. And so items come into us through these pathways, but we also recognize that even if we receive these cultural resources through a complete legitimate space where we paid the amount of money to the artist, or that someone donated it, the artist donated it for our holdings, that if we were to hold on to this cultural resource and it was inhibiting cultural revitalization, that is also a colonial practice, because we are taking ownership of those cultural resources. So if the community wants it back, even if it didn't come into the museum through a colonial pathway, the pathway going out is colonial, then we need to repatriate it back. So we also want to make sure that is really important when we think about the pathways and how we defined repatriation. And I think that's my 5 minutes. And so that was really quick, but I wanted to make sure that I shared. So this is my contact if anyone wants to reach out.
Thank you, Brandie, for your presentation. There is a request that we ask our speakers to present a little bit slower, but then we are also aware of the time constraints. So we are going to try and do our best to balance, to bring about the balance. Without further waste of time, I will also allow our next speaker to continue with the discussion. We are going to take comments and open up the floor after the last speaker is giving his or her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Laura van Broekhoven, and I'm at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and I just want to say how inspiring Brandie's presentation was, because a lot of what they're doing is very much grounded in policy making while also doing the practice. And I think I need to say that a very similar trajectory is what the Pitt Rivers Museum is doing. I'll try and share my screen just to show a number of pictures so that people know where I'm speaking from, for those of you who've not been into the Pitt Rivers Museum. But I'm very much speaking from a position of someone who is leading an organization deeply rooted in coloniality, which is also very much visible, I think, from the visuals, the sort of Victorian age space that the Pitt Rivers Museum breeds and showcases. And what we're really trying to do is to see how can we work towards reimagining and recalibrating our values, our purpose, our policies and practices. And while there's a real shift happening, there's also, it's very noticeable, having sort of been in some of the conversations today and especially yesterday, that some of what we're doing is still light years away from the visionary thinking that Achille Mbembe was sharing yesterday, but that other very inspirational thinking that I've been privy to personally and that I've been educated to so just to bring in a number of women in the room, much like Brandie also did earlier, people like Amy Laundrie, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, and for myself personally also, having been trained trained by Ndhlovu activist Aurora Perez Jimenez, people from the leadership of the Museum Detox Network, but also feminist activist collectives such as Simone Zeefuik, Hodan Warsame, Tirsa Balk in the Netherlands, and activism of students here in Oxford. So I think that is very much sort of acknowledging that there's a whole range of people who've been very much part of the sort of movement that is happening in museums, becoming other kind of spaces. And I suppose that on the one hand, the Pitt Rivers Museum for many people is sort of their most favorite museum in the world, and people find it breathtaking and fascinating. What we are questioning is, why is that so? That for some people, it's an incredibly uncomfortable space to come into, and for others it's actually the most fascinating, eye-opening, best museum in the world. Our visitor numbers are going sort of up and up, steeply up to 500,000 visitors a year, while at the same time other people who come into the museum feel very uncomfortable, and they actually, much like Rhodes Must Fall in 2015, tweeted, "The Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford." And just a couple of months ago, the Black Lives Matter, with the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement made our museum also very much a space for protests and a space of protesters being outside of the museum, and ourselves engaging in conversations, because we acknowledge that there are several issues in the museums, including, for example, the fact that we don't speak openly about some of the issues around how those collections came into the museum. Often we're completely ignorant about the colonial complicities of the museum in keeping certain parts of our objects. And until very recently, we had human remains on display that we've now taken off display. Again, something that made a lot of people very uncomfortable coming into the museum, while at the same time, I'm receiving a lot of upset and anger of people of the fact that we've taken those human remains off display, because people here, in a sort of, from a sort of, speaking from a position of entitlement, of seeing those bodies and feeling that they were there for their learning, their entertainment, and their research. If we look at how collections have come into the museum, we've been much more open about how they've come into the museum, and also how that is very, very closely connected to the coloniality of our collections, seeing how the more darker sort of colored parts of Africa, in this case, we have collections from all across the world. About a quarter are from Europe, a quarter from Africa, a quarter from Asia, and the other quarter from the Americas and Oceania, are very much linked, and the largest proportion are very much from where empire was present. What we're trying to do is to sort of change our praxis, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into this, but very much sort of looking at how decoloniality can transform our praxis as in practices that are based in theoretical thinking. We are part of the University of Oxford, and a lot of our activity is about ensuring that we decolonize, that we work towards self-representation and co-curation, and humanizing, activating, and mobilizing our museum from different societal perspectives, including some of the really big crises that we, I think, are faced with in today: the social justice crisis, migrational crisis, with millions of people moving and needing to look for refuge, the crisis of the precarity of our planet, and then obviously a racial justice crisis and a health crisis. We are, much like Brandie was saying, trying to make sure that we also embed some of that, from some of those practices in new policies. We're not at all as far along as Brandie and the Museum of Us, but we are looking at how do we embed some of our work into new policies making, and more specifically around the procedures for the return of cultural objects taken as part of military violence, looting, or other duress, or sold by people who weren't entitled to sell them. We have a program called Origins and Futures, where we work with Indigenous researchers and artists, and one important aspect of that work is really looking at how do we bring together epistemologies in unlocking some of the difficulties that we see in our collections and some of those colonial complicities. I think that is probably about what my 5 minutes allow me in time for, but I will share a link to this project there's 2 full-length documentaries that were made of the project. And I'll share that in the chat for anybody who would like to know more. It brought the largest delegations of Maasai, Kenyan and Tanzanian Maasai communities to the museum, identifying 5 among the 188 objects, 5 very particularly problematic objects. One of the Laibon of the Maasai, Laibon the Maron, who's the son of Laibon Mokombo, came with the Enkidong, which is a sacred gourd, and through the Maasai epistemology, read what the past was of those objects, of which we had very little information actually. And we're now looking to see how we could reconcile some of these really problematic ongoing trauma that it is causing for families in Maasai territories. We've had several events, which, in some cases were live streamed and were followed by 15,000 people across the globe. So it's quite clear that there is a great appetite for this sort of work, I think, and a great need also for this sort of work. I think what is, just in all honesty, and going back to what I started with, is that I know that there's a lot of work to be done, both in our own organizations, which are very much have been rooted in being part of the problem, in seeing how we can undo that and become institutions that are very much part of that process of atonement, of redress, and obviously repatriation is part of that necessity to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that presentation. And our next speaker, our presenter that I will now invite, is Flower. Flower, please take up the platform. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bongani, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to every speaker. And I'm going to speak about the decolonization on the aspect or perspective of the colonized country, which is Tanzania. And as we all know, that Tanzania was colonized with the German and later the British. So for a country like Tanzania, decolonization is like a progressive work which started soon after independence. So when we are speaking about decolonization, it's not only about the museum. We are speaking of all the institutions which were once colonized. We are all speaking of all the country and how now to transform the mindset of the people who were once decolonized and now they are supposed to be free. So for Tanzania and as country at large, the colonization process started with all these institutions, and it appears as if the museum has lagged behind doing this work of decolonizing itself as a colonial institution. And we should all remember that working at the National Museums of Tanzania as the colonial institution itself, the setup is not user-friendly to the local people, including the curators. Why? Because the administration, the way it was set up, it was only to suit the whites, and also the building itself where it is located. It's not located to the place where the community is. It is located to the area where there is administration blocks, or I can say the state house. So this was used to be the governor's house. So the museum itself is located in a place where you cannot find a normal person visiting the area without any reason. So for us, I feel like the national museums, especially from the colonized countries, they are so positioned themselves in areas which are not reaching or engaging the communities. And also I can say that the museum themselves, they were kept as a place for enlightenment, education. And the Africans at that time were not supposed to be part of the museums. So as you see, these museums were not meant for Africans. and they were just used as a place for education. And that's why you hear most of the museum education and all these exhibitions which were put in the museums were mainly using all these academic jargons, which if you have not gone to the school, you will not understand them. And again, the kind of the exhibitions which were put in the museum, the National Museum, during the colonial time, while these Africans were also there, these exhibitions were alienating the Africans in terms of the content, where the exhibitions, the cultures that were exhibited were compared against one another, where you find that one culture is said to be more superior against the other. So you see, this kind of the exhibition were not welcoming to the local people. And also the environment itself is not welcoming to the local people. So what really happened after independence? Just after independence, you see that the Africans who were not meant to have the museum ability, like curators, were mainly working as the gardeners and as technicians. And now, boom, Tanzania is free. You're supposed to take the country and take the museum. So you see that the museum, the National Museum of Tanzania, still had the white curator. I mean, the curators who are European until in 1970s. When one of the scholars who came back and started to take over, and this was just a technician. So for us as Black or Tanzanian curators, we have a problem now of fitting into the space. And when I'm saying about the curators, it's not only myself, even the administration. You find that you have the museum administration, which doesn't even understand where to start fixing itself and create this setup where the administration, the setup will welcome the Black and as well welcoming other communities. So for us as the National Museum, you find that there has been a lot of work to decolonize first the environment, the atmosphere itself, to make the curators and the people who are working there as Blacks to feel home and to feel engaged. So you find that we have the museums where everything is like, we have these disclaimers, do not touch, do not come close, where there is no connection for people to feel the culture, as well, even the labels. So for us as curators from the National Museum, first of all, we started to stop using the colonial objects the way they were being used. So we use the object and give them the other narratives. So we are trying to put something else, because the labels themselves, they are so racist. They speak against you as the curator and again against the community. So when you're trying to work with all these materials, you need to be very sensitive, because again, you are going to be drawn on these emotional things when you bring them with all these labels. And for us also, we were also working with all these interactivity questions. How do people could engage with museum? Because the location itself is not friendly, and the collections, they are so labeled in a way that it's not explainable to the local. And again, the exhibition, because the research agenda at that time were also racist. So when you go about all these materials behind the collections and the exhibition, you cannot even display them. So as the curators now, we came back and we were trying to fit all these collections behind the storage, because we can't take them to the exhibition gallery. That's why when you come to our museum, you'll find a lot of material behind the storage, rather than finding them on the exhibition wall. So for us now, the materials in the storage, we were trying to exercise them to see what do they carry. So for us, we came to realize first the materials which the British left for us were the materials that came from the outcasted group, meaning the witchcraft material. You don't find any useful material that speak about the African culture in a positive way. You find all these materials which are like witchcraft and all these things which are from the outcasted groups. So you cannot bring all these materials speaking for one ethnicity. So for us, first of all, we started to, I can say it's like classifying the materials. And since the materials which are coming from all this negativity, we had to let them stay in the board. And when we are trying to bring life into them, it's better to use art to bring life into them. But how now the National Museum started to work on the core function and to try to decolonize. First of all, the National Museum started to establish the Ethnicity Day, where the museum hosts the ethnicity of a program. And we don't call it education program because you don't educate the people about their culture. They are living in the culture, so you can't say that you're educating them. But it's all about the program, bringing them to experience and to engage with the museum, and for them now to express, because some of us, we are also not known to these cultures, because Tanzania has more than 125 ethnicities. So even if you are coming from one or two ethnic groups, you cannot engage with all these 100 ethnicity. So when we welcome these people annual to celebrate and commemorate the ethnicity or the ethnic day, they will bring the materials, they will experience their life and the day-to-day activities in the museum. And that's how they appreciate museum. And you find that some of them, they comment that the museums, they felt like the museum were for the whites and all these are educated Black. So you find all these ideas which are behind people's mind, because the museum, normally it didn't open these doors before. People can now come into the discussion and raise up all these issues. But again, we made sure that the museum is adjusting or addressing the contemporary issues that are facing the Africans or the Tanzanians. So for us, we came with the Museum Art Explosion program, where now the artists and the communities, and when I mean the artists, is not only the painters and the people who are doing carvings, but also the performers. They come to the museum, they organize their own activity with the museum curator, and we arrange the day for them to present this. And these activities are linked to the contemporary challenges like corruption. Sometimes they address the pregnancy issues for the children who are still in schools, and also for the waste management issues. So you see that the museum now is trying to link itself to the contemporary challenges which are facing the country, and all these news, the negative news which are appearing into our day-to-day life. And we are trying to bring now the community to use all these events which are negative to bring awareness. So sometimes you see decolonization in the museum, especially the National Museum of Tanzania, is not only the work of the curator and the administration. We feel like it's the work of the entire community, because the museum itself, its idea was to alienate even the curator, because the curator is also white. So I think for this session, I would like to wrap up that for me, I see like decolonization is the means and a way of breaking a taboo. We need to break all these taboos which were there during the colonial time, and give all this room for the community to come and engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Flower, for that analysis. Now, colleagues, allow me to welcome Jérémie to the floor.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. Great. I'm going to start off by suggesting a slight modification to the title of this session. Let's move from getting practical to getting dirty. There is, of course, a sense of engagement and of working with our hands involved already in the original title for this session. But for me, practical is somehow too neutral, too benign, too easy, and that's not quite fit for purpose. Dirty, by contrast, is, I think, a clearer, more powerful, and more provocative call to action. And action is certainly what is needed if we're going to have any chance at all of cleaning up the conflicted, compromised, and complicit colonial mess that sits at the very core of the vast majority of our museums. My approach to decolonization is, in short, decolonization as practice. Instead of translating theory into practice, as it's formulated in this session description, I find it more useful to talk in terms of practice that generates theory, not the other way around. And I'm hoping I can inspire some of you out there to join me in that outlook. Working within the Nordic context, I have been pioneering a form of disruptive museology for the past 4 years that has focused in particular on state indigenous or state Sami relationships. While serving as director of Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum or Northern Norway Art Museum based here in Tromsø, I led projects that radically challenged and extended established thinking in the museum sector. In 2017, for example, the museum I directed, which is fully financed by the Norwegian state, disappeared entirely, overnight and with no prior warning, to re-emerge as a fictional indigenous institution, the Sami Deidemuseet, or Sami Art Museum, fully equipped with an entirely different collection of art and an accompanying graphic identity, including t-shirts, buttons, business cards, and digital platforms. This project, a collaboration with a Sami museum partner, Museet, was not only about visualizing, spatializing, and making very tangible the enormous blind spots encapsulated in the overall Nordic mentality, which can roughly be said to be characterized by a combination of exceptionalism and denial, both past and present. It was also a hard-hitting form of institutional self-criticism that spoke directly and clearly about the ways the museum has been failing and continues to fail its local community. And that's as illustrated by this set of images showing the alarming gaps and omissions that exist in the museum's mission statement, itself a colonial tool of exclusion and epistemicide. The past few months, I have been working further in this vein, creating a series of new images and ideas that probe, provoke, and problematize colonial legacies and mindsets in the Nordics, again with a specific focus on state indigenous or state Sami relationships. What happens, for example, when we really start rethinking our museums and other cultural institutions, in particular those with the most power, such as our national museums? In a Norwegian context, very interesting things begin to happen when we start hacking, subverting, and remaking things like the National Museum for Art, Architecture, and Design as an alternative institution that now includes indigenous Sami practices of Ndhlovu. Or similarly, a rebranding of the Norwegian opera and ballet, now suggestively remade and reconfigured as a site or stage that manages to include and advocate indigenous Sami practices of yoik. My way of thinking and working is then driven by design and experimentation. It is about making or crafting speculations, fictions, and fabulations that advance a clear critique, demand a response, and perhaps most importantly, point and posit a possible, productive, and positive alternative. Better worlds really are possible, but to arrive at a different tomorrow, we as museum professionals need to take more responsibility. We need to be agents of transformation and change. That means us doing the resisting, subverting, rebelling, repurposing, and remaking. Radical disruption from within. It's time to get dirty. Thank you.
Thank you, Jérémie. You started off this session by radically disrupting and also challenging the title and the theme of this session, calling upon us to get dirty and to move away from the central thesis of getting practical. And we've also indicated in your presentation a complete overhaul of a museum in an attempt to change it. And I have a question for you. And you also made reference to exploring and also looking at an alternative. And my question is, if you look, the mere presence of an alternative suggests the presence of a mainstream. So to what extent do you therefore locate a new museum? Is it an alternative to a mainstream, or the mainstream is an alternative to the new museum? Or do we therefore museums operate in that binary spaces, if there are binaries?
Yeah, thanks for that, Bongani. I would say that museums are really out of touch with their definitions of what mainstream is. That a lot of museums really lag behind, right? So the work I did, for example, indigenizing the Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, it's viewed by many people as radical. I very quickly get the label of museum activist, but I say in response to that I was simply dragging an art museum into maybe the 1980s in 2020, right? And that to me is a very frightening and indeed depressing thing, because I think that, you know, if we at least manage to make our museums mainstream in the present, then our museums wouldn't be out of touch with Black Lives Matter and all the other demands for change that our communities are asking for, because there's such a big time lag. So that's maybe not a direct answer to your question, but I think going mainstream would already be an improvement on staying deeply conservative and colonial.
That's quite an interesting look at this, and also, Flower, allow me to bring you in at this point. You've spoken very eloquently about what your museum has done, but we've also argued that the focus should not only be museums, but we should tackle and decolonize broadly. In all our spheres, we should try to tackle and also confront this question of coloniality and broadly also decolonize. But it's also indicated to us how and what attempts and initiatives you've taken or made to see to it that other communities are part of your engagement. But also in doing so, in decolonizing, you are editing out, you are taking out biographies of those objects. So how therefore do you see to it that the experience of violence does not get lost as we engage, as we undo the old? If then you can take us through that.
Thank you, Bongani. And that is really a good question. First of all, the biographies of the collections, they are not correct. Because in reality, what is written about those people, it's what the Europeans saw, but what they didn't know behind the meaning. You find that some of the objects like the spear, which might look so like a normal spear to someone who is a guest to that ethnic group, might just describe it as like a spear from so-and-so group. But this spear, it has other meaning and use. The meaning and function associated to it is not written. So when you take this maybe object to the exhibition, and now these museums are open to each and every community, and this group or ethnic group comes to visit the museum, they all go crazy. Like, why did you put this object, which is not supposed to go public, in your exhibition, and you are Black? And first of all, they will wonder, you are Black and you are breaking all these cultural taboos to the group, to other groups. So you are first, you are not respecting their culture. And second, they feel like as Tanzanians, we should try to preserve each other. And now you are doing like the white. So first of all, the information behind the objects, they are not correct. The meanings are not there, and they didn't do thorough research. So some of the objects were just taken out of people's territories, just out of curiosity and all this entertainment, the way they are saying that museums should be entertaining. So they bring the object to the museum just to entertain themselves. But this object, they carry a lot of meaning, like the objects which were used for the girls' initiation ceremonies or boys and all these ritual practices. So for me as an African, I can take this out. And again, the biography is not right because it describes it into too general for someone even to get to know the knowledge behind. And maybe one question I have to my fellow colleagues who are coming from European institutions is how do they handle the issue of acquiring knowledge from the indigenous community, and especially now in 21st century, based on these objects which are already there in Europe? And how do they make sure they don't redo what the colonialists or the colonizers used to do, all these anthropological studies, and try to extract knowledge from the local people and go to reproduce it again without them knowing? Or even if they know, you have your agenda within another agenda. So for me, I would really like to know, how do they make sure they don't reproduce another colonial issues out of all this decolonizing project going on with the local community?
That's a very good question, Flower, to sum up and also to challenge us to think differently. Allow me also to piggyback on this one, and Brandie, if you could, you also made reference to languages and the impact of language in the act of doing a new museum or a new museology, or in the act of getting data, but also brought in indigenous people as experts who will therefore contribute in museum making. If, as an attempt to answer and to respond to Flower's also question, if you can also try to assist us with what type of expertise those communities brought into the museum experience and the impact it has on content, on the museum content.
You're asking me, right? I just want to confirm. So I think it's a big question. Both of them are really big questions, and really important questions as well. And so one of the shifts that we make, and we've changed it in our policies and in our practices, is taking a step back and recognizing that consent is really important, especially during these consultations. We do a lot of consultations for NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a federal legislation about repatriating ancestors and ceremonial funerary items and items of cultural patrimony, or objects of cultural patrimony. We also do, we've had community members from the Maasai community come in, and we've had community members from Peru and from Maya diaspora community members as well. And so one of the things that we do is we take a step back, is that the consultation process are not necessarily, we're not engaging in a transactional space of like where we're acquiring knowledge and we're mining for more knowledge to make sure that our cultural resources are updated, because we've done that for so long. And that's what we don't want to replicate, that colonial practice. And so we ask for consent during the entire time. Is it okay for us to take notes when they're sharing personal stories about their relatives? Is it okay if we have this? Can this go into the archives? What are the cultural protocols that need to be in place around interacting with these cultural resources? If someone is menstruating, can they interact with this cultural resource? And we have those protocols written in to the space, so that way we know whether or not we can interact with them in different spaces. Or if also, can this be on display? What season can it be on display? So consent and acknowledgement that that the objects that we hold and the ancestors that we hold are community members' connection to their past, present, and their future, that they're not inanimate objects. And it's completely switching that epistemological, that approach around the way that we see these cultural resources, that they're not just these things that we have. And so that they're relatives, their belongings. So I think that that's really important, that engagement. What that's done is that's transformed the way that we treat our cultural resources. Like, the way that we are able to preserve our cultural resources and stewardship, the connection that cultural resources and ancestors have to their communities. And it's also enhanced our relationship building, where communities want to work with us more. Trust is, there's no reason that communities and indigenous communities should ever trust us as museums as a whole, and especially with us with the 100 years of colonial legacy that we have. And so this is an action of trying to build that trust back. And sometimes they say no, and sometimes they want to take cultural resources back, and sometimes they say, no, you can't take this down. We also shift our practices where during consultations, if the community wants to be alone with their cultural resources, then our staff step out of the room because it's their belongings. We also let them know that they can touch it with or without gloves, but know that it's probably treated with arsenic or some sort of chemical, but it is their decision because it's their relatives and their ancestors' belongings. So shifting those practices and that ethos of how we practice is really important in the way that we track our cultural resources. And we're also working around what does it look like to on evaluation, to track evaluation in the context of, is our consultation process just good for us, or is it good for communities? And so we ask them what a successful consultation would look like. And then we adapt our consultation process based upon those communities and write that into our access policy. We ask each different community that. So a Maya community is going to be different than a Kumeyaay community, than a Peruvian community, than a Maasai. And so we have that fluidity that's built within our access policies and practices. I don't know, I hope that that answered your question. It was a long answer, but I think there is no one. I think consent and then acknowledgement and truth-telling and honoring indigenous peoples and their knowledge, and recognizing that colonization has impacted as well them just as much as it, because of the ways that we've held on to cultural resources. So the repatriation of knowledge, repatriation of items is extremely important in that connection process.
Thank you for that. Yes, it does broadly address the questions that I posed. And also, your responses make me think in terms of representation. You said you were interacting broadly with communities from different backgrounds and different also settings, which also brings me to Laura's presentation. She elaborated broadly on the notion of colonial complicity, and to a degree also those of us who have been involved with attempts to try to reimagine museum spaces differently. Sometimes then, Laura, we find ourselves in an attempt to undo the past, also as museum practitioners taking positions of authority. And then to what extent, therefore, can we take a pause, a break, and allow communities in these spaces, as you say, uncomfortable spaces, allow communities to take a driving seat to dictate the changes that they preferably want, or such an ideal or a notion, is it achievable, given your experiences?
I think that's a really good question, and absolutely what in the case of the Maasai project, but also in other projects that I've been involved in personally, with, for example, Kapor, communities from Brazil and communities from Suriname, where and going back to the question also that Flower posed about, how do we ensure that these are not neo-colonial practices instead of decolonial practices that we're developing, where it is exactly the sort of letting go of that authority, the letting go of that curatorial feeling of entitlement to speak and to take the microphone, I think is an extremely important part of that. In case of the Maasai, it was very much on the one hand, the sort of openness where we knew there was an Indigenous leadership program taking place in Oxford, where we invited the Indigenous leaders to come to the museum, see some of the objects that we have in the collections, and the reaction of Samuel Nangiria, who's a human rights activist from Tanzania, immediate reaction reaction saying that he was very upset seeing this, didn't understand how that would have ever been taken legitimately out of our collections, questioning the language that we were using in saying that it was collected, and then sort of saying he would go back to the elders of one of the villages in Tanzania, and then he sort of organized and self-organized very much with us, fundraising for some of that, ensuring that work could happen, and then sending a film actually to the museum saying how annoyed they were with these objects being there. So in that sense, it was very much sort of our organization. I think it's difficult for, and going back to the second session of yesterday, that's where Siraj and some people were talking about how we've been so trained as museum people to think almost as technocrats in filling databases and thinking about our practices as the way forward for museums and how we best care for objects, and having to rethink all of that, I think, is such an important component of the work. I think that what is obviously important there is to make sure that it's not the museum again who is gaining mostly out of this, but it's actually the communities themselves. And in that sense, very much what Brandie was already saying about consent, about also looking at maybe acknowledging some of the necessities of traditional knowledge being registered under traditional knowledge licenses, and looking at what might be possible, what might be needed there. So in the case of the Maasai, it's very much that the project advances very much authored by the Maasai delegates, but also has led both for the organization itself needing to shift in acknowledging and working towards how an epistemology which is based on Laibon coming in with a sacred Enkidong and reading the past and the present and the futures of these objects corresponds to this historical epistemology that museums are so well versed in, and saying actually we have to acknowledge that that epistemology is very much inferior to the epistemology of Maasai, who've been able to identify in a lot more precision whose history and whose present is being affected by this. So that's a long answer and maybe a bit vague, but I think it's a very important question that you're asking there, Bongani. And I also wonder, one of the things, for example, another project that we're working is with the Tibet communities, Tibetan communities, and I know Tupten is in the room actually because he just wrote to me, who is himself a Tibetan person who's organizing with the Tibetan community from the Tibet collections. And obviously there, that's not just one geography that we're working with, but Tibetans across so many different countries and so many different areas in the world, having to see how the museum can be a useful instrument to bring together communities, to question some of the way that stereotypes have been created on Tibet, has been a really exciting program of work, and at the same time is a really challenging for an institution like ours and the resources that you have or don't have, and the possibilities, especially, and this is where yesterday I felt that I was really in two different worlds between what is allowed for museums to do in Europe, for example, when they're Grade 1 listed buildings and all those sort of categories which are very sort of limiting about what we're allowed to do in change and what we should be doing in realizing in change.
Thank you. Let me now open up this discussion to all the participants. From the chat room, there are a few questions, and one of those questions is, in all these attempts, who drives these initiatives? Who's in the driving seat? Who's represented? That's one question. Another question is, for those initiatives that involve a number of communities and role players, if there's a disagreement, what happens? I'm just going to allow, openly, I will also allow you to respond, but I will not pick up a panelist. You are sort of free to respond to these two questions for now, in no particular order. Who would like to take a first bite? Jérémie, Brandie, Laura, Flower, you are free.
I can hop in. Maybe just to comment around that first question you posed that came from the chat about this idea of driver seats or sort of who's in charge and things. I think that muted. Sorry, I think I muted myself suddenly by mistake. In terms of who's in the driving seat, I think that there's a general discussion that's very important to be had in terms of roles and positionality and power, and being aware of the power that museum professionals wield. So for myself, for example, we're all working in very different contexts, but I was keenly aware of my position as the director of an art museum in the north of Norway, in a place that had been ignoring its indigenous communities, and that I was either going to be part of the continuing ongoing problem or attempt to do something to make change. So that doesn't mean I'm in the driver's seat. I think there's all sorts of problematic issues that happen if someone like me or a sort of settler institution museum comes in and starts solving problems. That's not what it's about. It's about collaboration and co-creation and making change together. But I think there's a lot to do about awareness of, it's not about necessarily who's in that driver's seat, but being aware of what one's position and whether you like that position or not, understanding the power hierarchies and relationships, and then doing sort of a good enough job of trying to work with that and to make change, and not let that be a sort of debilitating factor, because I think that's what we see in the museum. Everybody's just scared to death of making change because we might get it wrong, and at what cost, right? I would say make honest attempts to reach out, create relationships, and try to make change. And maybe we find out better ways to do that change through the doing. But I think the most harmful thing we can do is to not take action at all.
Thank you. Laura or Brent, would you like to tackle the question around communities and what happens if there's a disagreement?
Laura, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
You go.
Yes. So if there's so I think it goes, it's both questions are deeply tied as who's driving the work. The communities are the ones who are driving our work. So we Decolonizing initiatives, at least for our museum, is driven by the community. So we're hearing the wants and needs and requests of community members, and we've taken all of that data. And then we also have focus groups and a Decolonizing initiative working group that is staffed with our board members, our staff members, and also our indigenous community members. And we're also actively working with different tribes, councils, and committees around heritage preservation. And they're the ones who are working with us to create the policy around access and repatriation policy, and also display policies. So the Colonial Pathways policy was a collaborative process. It wasn't just driven by me writing fancy words. And I think that that's the situation, is the same thing around if there's a disagreement around repatriation, because there are, and people don't always agree about the way things should be displayed or the way that cultural resources should go back to communities, or which community, because different bands or different areas. And so that's where sometimes there's also overlap around repatriation around homelands where the cultural resources came from, because there are two communities that reside in those areas. And so the law usually says that we are the ones that decide, because we're the authorities and we have the power and we have control, and this the label of ownership and the legal ownership. But we as an organization wrote in our policies that the communities decide. So we take a step back and ask the communities if they want us to hold that platform where we're a part of the conversation, or if they would like to have that conversation to decide. And sometimes it's a decision that is made from the community within a week or so, and then sometimes it's several years before a repatriation can happen, because the communities need to come together and figure out what is best for both of the communities, and they need to decide. And so that is where it's not us, it's them, and where they want to sit and what their responsibilities and their priorities are at that moment. It means that the museum's timeline is in the community's timeline. The museum's timeline needs to be fluid and flexible in a non-linear process, because the communities are the ones who are dictating the artwork. And so we also sit in a space where if the community is going to take, like, it needs 2 years to have this conversation around repatriation, then we can take a pause, and then we also can work on other spaces around access policy or work with different communities or something. But we're not pushing the community based upon, like, because we think that they need to hurry up. Like, we're not the dictators on that. And so that's kind of where we sit with several different communities around repatriation right now, is this space of kind of what do they as the groups want. And then the internal conversation is, if, for example, like the Kumeyaay, if they are trying to decide whether or not this should be repatriated back or what, that's their decision internally. And so again, we just take a step back because that's not our place to be in the midst of it at all, unless they want to invite us in, and then we'll come in.
Can I just briefly sort of, I think very much, you know, what Brandie was saying, and in going back to who's in the driver's seat, I think we do need to acknowledge that much of this change is only happening now, while it's been demanded, that change, for so long by indigenous communities, you know, in the Arctic North for 1,000 years since colonization has happened, for the communities in other parts of the world, in the Americas, for 500 years that people have been objecting to this, resisting. And I think that is so important for museums, not to say, oh, look at how great we are at decolonizing, but actually acknowledging that a lot of the work we're doing is, as Jérémie also was saying earlier, catching up and trying to do our best. And I think it is, you know, very much what I notice in our organization, that there is still a lot of, you know, sort of our own staff, and I suppose sort of we took the summer to really look at anti-racism and decoloniality with a broader set of our staff, because we were closed anyway, so also our front of house and our retail staff being included much more, and I think we still do struggle, as many European organizations, with the sort of institutional white fragility, discipline, of our disciplines, also very much that sort of white fragility, and also at the same time this sort of white saviorism, where we're being the most exquisite at decolonizing, and also the sort of mix of, on the one hand, I think we need to be very open with some of our issues around how colonial we are and how things were taken under duress and as part of military violence, but just saying that does not resolve the situation. It needs to go much deeper and much further than that. And I think that is where this relationship building, and us also, you know, giving ourselves the time to really change more deeply. And I really feel that, you know, so what some of the things that Brandie has been talking about, and Jérémie and Flower, are extremely important for us to listen and learn and see how we can adapt and change, because it is a process, and to acknowledge that it's going to be a long, long road ahead of us.
Flower, perhaps you may also help us to respond to this question. What happens to, thank you, Laura, for that. What happens to the objects we don't like? What happens to the objects we discard? What authority do we have to decide that those objects do not deserve to have a space in a museum or in our community spaces?
Okay. First of all, for the National Museum, now we are trying to figure out the issue of policy, the collections policy. And the collection policy, if you want to amend it, you need to have representative of the communities. And some of these objects, when you say you don't want them in the museums, they might be wanted in another area, maybe a community museum, because now the National Museum is really encouraging the communities to explore the cultural tourism sector and open all these community museums. So for us, we feel like the National Museum has now the role to play to ensure the community, they have their own museums. And if the National Museum, since it's so far away from the community, it needs to know how to delegate also some of the collections which are needed to certain communities, because sometimes as the curator, we are looking into these political and social structures of the country. Sometimes the politics might influence us to say no to some collections, but some of community museum could use these collections for their own purposes and also for the cultural tourism sector. So for us, we have first now tried to amend all these colonial policies, and also after independence, we had some of the museum policies which are not fitting into the 2020 ideologies. So there is a lot of work administrative wise and also with the strategic plan of the museum to make sure it goes with time and also with the issues, and also not to discard some of the culture, but at least to engage these people to decide. Thank you, Bongani.
Thank you. Some of the objects that are in museum spaces as we decolonize are objects that were, as a result, a product of practice. This museum, later on, these objects find themselves in museum spaces. And as objects of use, they were touched, people engaged with. And there's a question, therefore, the museum is paranoid. There's that paranoia about preserving, not touching. And yet, on the other hand, communities would like to engage to touch these objects. How do we navigate that? That's a question from the floor.
Just really quick, because I think I mentioned just briefly as well, is for us, we step back. If communities want to touch, they touch. There's gloves that are also provided. We also mentioned that some of the cultural resources probably have been treated with chemicals, harmful chemicals. And so it's up to them. In addition to, like, if the communities want to be in a space without us, we leave the space and then let them know that we'll come back when they're ready for us to come back. But it's very much, if that's what they want to do, then that's because it's their belongings. But also is that it may break and it may cause harm. But being fully transparent about all of that and letting the communities decide is kind of where it versus us decide.
Yeah, same in our case. I think one of the things what we do talk quite a bit of extensively about the fact that we know that all of our objects have been sprayed with every possible pesticide in the world, including lead and sort of DDT and all sorts of pesticides that are really harmful. So being very open about that. We are also trying to make sure that, for example, for musical instruments, if people want to play them, or objects that people want to wear, that we're trying to find funding to actually do more research on knowing how long these kind of pesticides live on objects, so that people can actually safely put them back into use. But it is something that I think many collections will suffer from not being able to be very open, and so because you want people to sort of be informed that they might be poisoning themselves.
Museum professionals and museum in general, we like this idea of community involvement, engagement. Museum becoming safe spaces for unsafe ideas or for challenging ideas, and museums as spaces of public engagement. In theory, it sounds good, and in practice, sometimes it's not achievable. You have deadlines. You have your supervisor who wants this exhibition on this particular day. You also have your board that expects you to deliver by that particular day. How do you, on that particular day, you have deadlines to take care of. So how do you balance deadlines? And when you consult, who do you consult? How do you choose? Who gets involved and who's excluded in such processes, given the nature of the museum space and the fact that it is a contested space? Who would like to take a bite on this one? You.
I can briefly, I just don't want to take up too much space. But so we we have grants that are specific, like a year grant or 2 grants that say that we're going to do all of these deliverables with a specific Indigenous community. And the community's needs and their time and COVID and everything hits and changes. And communities don't have time to work with us, or like they're not interested, and so the work or navigating 32 bands within a community, a tribal community, and each band has a different requirements and needs, and also space. The distance is challenging too. So we're really transparent within our grants, within our reporting of the grants, is that this is what's happening, that this is a part of decolonial work, that it takes time. And sometimes the timelines don't match up because society consistently changes, impacts of colonization changes, and we also have to adapt. And so we've been really clear with our the people that we're talking to deliverables with, and also communicating actively with the communities, the Indigenous communities at the same time, is like, well, what do you want? Would you like us to shift these deliverables? Would you like us to request it to be different based upon where you sit now? And our granting organizations have actually been really flexible, because they also recognize that this work changes, and 2 years looks different than when the first year, when you first wrote it, or the year before that when you wrote it. And so that's kind of where it sits, is that we've just been really actively working, and communication is a huge part of this work, and being flexible is a part of the work. We also have it in our policy, like if we're doing inventory, is that we need to shift, because we can't work with this section of an inventory because all of our staff members are menstruating individuals, and there's protocols around this section. That we make sure we have a plan C and a plan B, and we shift to another space. And maybe it's going to be another 3 months before we can work with the left wing of our cultural resources around inventory because of those specific protocols. But that's the policy. And so we've really shifted the culture of our organization to be able to shift and move and navigate based upon the protocols of the cultural resources and the communities.
Some additional comments and input from other panelists. How do we navigate the difficulties of deadlines? And when we decide to engage with communities, who do we exclude? Who do we listen to? There's a question from the floor. 2 questions from the floor.
For our case, most of the time we do things into phases, and if we are having like a representation from the community, we have to consider the phase 1, phase 2. So the project must be divided into phases. And why? Because of the region. We know that during the colonial time, already the region was so distributed according to tribes. So when you are trying to engage community and you get more bias, maybe with the northern region, you leave the southern, it's another problem. So you need to have this project to be into phases and make sure that you reconsider all these tribes which are coming from different regions, so that they feel they are all belonging to the same space.
In a discussion like this, I was expecting this type of a question. And it's a difficult one for museum professionals. This is another comment from the floor. It questions who qualifies to work for a museum, and in a way also brings back to the table the question of organic intellectuals, and then are we in future? How are we going to involve them as knowers, as knowledge holders? And what would be their roles, or what is their role in a decolonized context? I'm not particularly picking up on anyone of you, but if anyone would sort of like to have a bite on this one.
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think there were interesting discussions coming up already yesterday around, this overall project of making change, of course, is not just for the museums, it's very much for universities as well, and our entire sort of hierarchies of power and knowledge structures. But I guess if we keep it slightly museum specific, I can give an example. I mean, my closest collaborator in the work I've been doing, a woman named Ndhlovu Oli, who is the director of the Ridudotu Museet that I've been closely collaborating with. She is Sami and also trained as a sort of conservator, an object conservator, and is doing really interesting work. I could put anybody that wants to get in touch with her in touch with On the Mai, questioning precisely that we know, for example, that duoyar, or Sami sort of craft people, that's a crude translation, but that they have knowledge that is much more appropriate for conservation of certain Sami objects than people with master's degrees or even PhDs in technical conservation. So they're already doing that work of using those people and employing those type of people to do certain work. So I mean, that's definitely the way forward. And if the universities aren't willing to sort of create new degree awarding programs in other forms of knowledge and conservation, then, I mean, that's an interesting space that museums could maybe start taking in these type of debates and work to employ people come up with, I mean, I think we need to think so differently and so radically new. So come up with new job titles and new job descriptions. I mean, that's the type of visionary leadership we need now in museums, that if we're going to create genuinely new institutions, we need to think very differently.
At this point also, I would like to remind all the participants that they are free to ask questions and comments either using the chat platform, or else also indicating to us that they would like to raise a question, so that we also allow you to gainfully contribute to this discussion. Jérémie, there is a question for you regarding certifying indigenous knowledge forms. Are we not ready to accept and validate them? In a way, you've answered, you've responded to that question, but the question is, are we ready to validate them without certification? That's the question.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think there may be some things lost in translation. So I think we're saying the same thing as the person asking the question. I'm certainly ready to, but I mean, it's not about certification either. I mean, but there is a need if we're going to move beyond these binaries that in the previous panels have been so well mapped out and revealed, then we do have to find systems. I mean, because we can't ignore as well that there are these existing structures in place. So we need to find productive and positive ways to make change. So when there's individuals like myself that are there and accept other forms of knowledge, then if you're in a position where you can make change an institution, if you're running an institution, then do that and start doing it straight away and don't put it off to tomorrow.
If I could also jump in, because I think it's, when we think about like the experts and the museums being the experts, and even just the requirement of needing a certificate or a master's degree or a PhD in a specific, or a degree in a subject, it's so colonial. Like, for us to say that you can go to school and become an expert on an outside culture, and you're more of an expert than the people who are actually from the culture and the people who live it and the people who have created the cultural resource and the ones who've cared for it. And someone who has been and gotten their PhD in Chickasaw, which is my tribe, Chickasaw and Choctaw, they're more of an expert than I am on my own community, or my elders are on our own community and our cultural knowledge and our traditional knowledge, our ancestors. And so I think that is really the shift, is that just taking the step back and recognizing that indigenous peoples are the experts on their own places. And also recognizing that there is an impact of colonization, and repatriation is a repatriation of knowledge. It's a repatriation of ancestral knowledge. And also, what does that look like? And it's a complex space to be sitting in, but taking that step back and not asking for a certificate or asking for it, but just being there, and that indigenous people are the authorities on their own communities and on their culture.
Working with communities, though, at the end of the day, we need to have an exhibition. We need to have an education program. And there are differences. A community is not a homogenic group of individuals. It has contested ideas, contested points of view. How do we manage that?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge, I think, that in our case, for example, that it is an issue, and it is very much an issue because a lot of the funding for this sort of work comes from external funders. So you need to work towards deadlines, and you need to work towards outcomes and products that they are expecting you to do. And obviously you can always, I think for the work with the Maasai, we've been very lucky to find philanthropic funding that is very understanding and wanting to support this kind of work. But for the more trusts and foundations funding, such as the Arts Council or the National Lottery Fund, it is a real issue. And I think it's one of the bigger questions of sort of if we are around recruitment of staff and who we and how we write our JDs, and how certainly in the UK and in Oxford University, you know, the bigger university, that a bigger institution that we are part of, which has very strict and definite regulations on the HR, we are at times sort of really strapped for what we are able to do. And I think, you know, as long as we keep copy pasting the JDs and using the same tools and using, it is one of our really big problems in these institutions like the one I'm part of, where even in a leadership position, you are part of that bigger organization that has its own regulations and its own. And I recently someone compared Oxford University with a sort of a cruise ship that if you want to change its course, it is almost close to impossible, even if sort of small bits and pieces of it want to change its course. And that's where I think it's about sort of both upwards doing in my case is very much upwards, trying to do some sort of lobbying and trying to change hearts and minds, alongside lots of the activism of students and the student unions, etc. But also being realistic about what we are able to do at the moment, and therefore philanthropic funding is a way out of that. I know it's not the perfect answer, but it is a very realistic. It's something that that I need to acknowledge is an issue for us.
As we move towards the closure, there is a comment also from the floor regarding attempts that we made in terms of navigating museums as spaces that hold objects, and also museums as spaces where communities are able to have a say in such a discussion. So it's a difficult process to be involved in and also to engage with. There has been in the past attempts to see museums or to see museums or the act of undoing museum as emancipation of culture. But in a context where museums are part of culture, how therefore do we try to separate that? The death of a museum as an attempt to free culture. Some people in modern times, calls have been made to burn down the museum, to kill the old museum, as you've done, Jérémie. You've completely overhauled a museum, and a new museum was born. But to what extent a new culture was free or emancipated, or to what extent was an old museum still present in the new museum? Or traces of an old museum?
Yeah, in the case of the work I've been doing or was doing, those projects, you know, it's a bit complex to pack into 5 minutes. It's speculative work, attempting to nudge things and create new spaces and to be productive. And it's work that moves in two directions, both trying to transform the settler institution, which is the Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, so that there will be lasting change. So the sort of the lasting effects of doing that type of work is that the museum now, all of its work and programming, regardless of content, Sami language is always used and included. That was never done before. There's multiple members of Sami people on staff now. That was never the case before. So those are really important changes. Unfortunately, other changes I would have liked to have seen done didn't get done. So the change to the museum mission statement, Well, if the board's not on board, you don't really get beyond that, right? And then the director has to go, in a sense. So so making these types of changes, it is very precarious, and it's sometimes it can feel depressing because it can be so person based that when there's a director willing to try to make change, you try to make change, and then you know, it just shift out the director and everything can go back to sort of super colonial mentalities. But I really liked what Flower had to say, this idea that you ended with, Flower, about like taboos and working with taboos. I think that's a great sort of metaphor for as just to continue to the work and just keep chipping away and be extremely resilient and not sort of give up, so that if, you know, I think the colonial vestiges of the institution, regardless of what we do, it's sort of a multi-headed hydra. It will keep popping back up, I think, and that it's not something that ends. We're not suddenly tomorrow we've arrived there and we've decolonized our institutions. There's the new forms of colonization and capitalism and all sorts of things. So it's a never-ending process. So it's to be like aware and alert and ready to sort of do the work that needs to be done, and identifying those taboos like Flower used, that I think is a very good sort of working methodology. It's like taboo working. I don't know.
Yeah, it is quite an interesting contradiction to work with taboos, trying to undo a taboo. As a way of closing, Laura, Brandie, Flower, and you, Jérémie, if you can also give us your concluding remarks for this session. Yes, Laura, concluding remarks?
Sorry, just to say how it's been really wonderful to listen to these amazing practices happening, and also it's been quite enlightening to know how you know, the sort of a lot of the thinking that is happening and that is pushing us forward is very much coming from the global south. I think there's, but also the Arctic North, and in particular indigenous peoples across the globe everywhere, which is challenging us, inviting us also, I think, to start rethinking. And it was a pleasure to be part of the conversation, and I really do hope that we can continue to engage in lots of different ways to make change happen.
Flower?
Thank you, Bongani, and thank you to everyone for getting this opportunity. And for me, I feel as an African curator, for us to be practical with decolonization concept, first of all, the curators who are of African origin, they need to occupy the museum space and they need to know what they are doing within the museum. And we need also to establish our own cooperation within the regions and also within Africa before going outside. So I feel like equal sharing of knowledge starts with the curator before going to the community. And if the curator doesn't understand what she or he is doing, it will not be possible for him or her to engage the community. Thank you.
Brandie?
I want to echo what Laura and Flower are saying. I'm so grateful to be able to hold this space and to be able to have this conversation and to be in a space with so many people that also care deeply about this and that are doing the work. I think is recognizing, like, because of our ancestors and the community members and the allies and the accomplices who have pushed for this work to happen, like, that's why I have this job. That's why my job even exists as a director of Decolonizing Initiative. That didn't exist when I first started in the museum field as a young whippersnapper. Like, it's madness, and my department didn't exist until 2 years ago. And so really, again, pushing that paradigm, I also think it's really important to think about, it's not just decolonizing initiatives, at least where I see it, is not just something that cultural resources do or is that we do in exhibits that we're around objects. We're also HR, huge perpetrators of colonization. So let's look at some of those HR policies where the law should be the ground that we build up from. and look at the ways in which that we are, like in all departments, in our communications and our marketing, that we're replicating colonial harm and perpetrating colonial harm. There's a question in terms of labels, and yes, we work with the indigenous communities. We've also switched our labels to where we're not recognizing the collector or the donator into our exhibits, that we're recognizing the makers, the indigenous people who made them. And so shifting that is like who has the priority and who is of value, I think is really important. And so I just wanted to think about this, it's so much bigger than just one thing that a department does. It should be the entire organization.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, big thank you from me as well, both to my fellow panelists, to you, Bongani, for a great moderation, and also for the organizers for including me in this. It's a real privilege to have taken part. I guess my closing words is to all of you out there that have been listening in. I'm assuming there's lots of you that are museum professionals working with all sorts of different positions and things, and to you know, acknowledge that we all wield forms of potentiality, and we can all be change makers, and we can do different types of change based on where our roles and positions might be in an institution, but we all can make changes. And it's those small incremental day-to-day practices of upheaval and resistance and revolution that can be small nuances that, like Brandie said, they lead to a new department eventually and a new position that didn't exist before. So I think, you know, it would be a really great thing to feel like that everybody out there that works in a museum is working to change those institutions every single day. And that would be a really great thing. And then we'll get there maybe in the end. Cheers.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists for the provocative engagements that and for tackling difficult questions today, and also for responding to the questions that were raised by the participants, and to all the participants for making this engagement productive and insightful. For me, it is very clear that the act of decolonizing and of doing is a continuous process. As we undo, we redo, but it will be a never-ending cycle, because the challenge will still be there for us to do things differently. And also for museum professionals also to engage with communities and also to look at things afresh. And from this discussion, what I'm taking is that it is important for us to be open to a number of perspectives, number of interpretations, because there is no one way of doing things the museum way. And for that engagement, this is what from this engagement, this is what I'll be taking home. But I would also like to thank the organizers for allowing us to engage visually and to tackle these difficult questions that we are confronted with, and to try also to come up with new and share also new ways of undoing and redoing museum.